My name is Gabe Woolley. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm a teacher, a son, a brother, and an uncle. In 2018, my nephew, Elijah Woolley, at 14 months old, died unexpectedly in his crib. The Wagoner County officials descended upon the home of my parents in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and a story of an unexpected death from sudden infant death syndrome was taken and spun as a murder and child sexual abuse by Wagoner County officials. As a result, Clayton Woolley, at 5 years old, was taken from his home and never returned. This is a story of a justice system operating under the guise of guilty until proven innocent. This is a story of injustice, a lack of accountability. The purpose of this podcast is to raise awareness, hold accountability, and it is a call to action for citizens of Oklahoma and the United States for checks and balances in our systems. This is the Rescue Clayton Podcast. My name is Gabe Woolley. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And today I'm sitting down with Traci Hicks from Michigan. And this is the Rescue Clayton Podcast. So Traci, we kind of like to start this podcast the same way with all our guests. We want you to kind of introduce yourself and explain your resume and your experience, and just give us some insight into your background before we get into the discussion about how it relates to Clayton and how it relates to this podcast. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Again, my name is Traci. Personally, I relate to the Woolley family as I am an extended family member. I'm actually Gabe's cousin. And professionally, I am a licensed social worker in the state of Ohio. I am from Michigan, but I'm living in Ohio currently. I have both my bachelor's and my master's degree in social work. And my concentration in my master's was mental health and trauma. My experience has ranged from I've had field placements working with youth in a diversion program. I also have experience in working with adults in adult protective services and aging services. And currently I am working with children and families on the autism spectrum and their caregivers. So kind of a variety of experience, but I've really found the population that I'm passionate about working with now.
That's awesome. I think it's really important to, there's a big difference really between, some people stumble across the work or are passionate in the beginning and sometimes things fade away, or sometimes people are just need a job. But when you are working in a field that you're actually passionate about, I think that's always really important. And I try to maintain that mindset when I work with teaching and understand that there's a deeper purpose behind what I'm doing. What made you want to get into social work?
Yeah, great question. So I was attracted to the field just because of how broad it is. With social work, you can work with pretty much any population in any setting. You can work in schools, hospitals. You can work with the aging population. You can work with kids, families, anyone in between. And I really liked how broad it was and how I could work with different populations and have so much experience ahead of me.
Right, absolutely. What would you say, how closely or to what extent, just from your personal opinion and observation, how does social work tie into DHS or Child Protective Services?
Yeah, so actually when I was getting my master's in social work, my field placement was working with DHS in the state of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. I worked with adults. I didn't do anything with the children's world there, but I see social work tying in with DHS, mainly in the values that it should exhibit. Social work values I see tying into how DHS should be. Yeah. It should be an agency that helps people, that keeps the independence and the dignity and worth of the person in mind, and always going for the least restrictive intervention when you're trying to help individuals or families.
Would you say a large objective is reunification, so long as it's healthy, home lifestyle and all that, or people have taken the steps and strides to come back to a healthy lifestyle?
Absolutely, yeah. I think from my knowledge, especially with child protective services, that should always be the goal. Reunification with the family, and then again, the least restrictive intervention as possible. So allowing the family to have the opportunity to take those steps to, to meet whatever requirements they need to meet in order to have that reunification.
Right, absolutely. And we hear that here too in Oklahoma, that that's supposed to be the main objective is reunification. So kind of considering Clayton's case or situation rather, as well as just other children in general, if a child is suddenly displaced from their home, a stable home even at that, and is placed into unfamiliar territory, a school, and a new home living with strangers, what are some potential behaviors you could see that child sort of express in social settings?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different things you could see. The first thing that comes to mind is if they're being displaced from a stable environment and they're being put into environments that are more unstable or not as structured. I think that lack of structure, especially with children who need more stability and structure and routines, I think that from that you can see mental health struggles as they get older and become adults too. I think sometimes we can see issues with physical health.
Mm-hmm.
That could manifest into chronic illnesses, substance use later down the line, potentially more interactions with law enforcement. So
Right.
I think the effects that you see from something like that could be so broad and so
Right.
vast, but it's really, really hard to say for sure. But I think the possibility is always there for almost any of those.
So there is even the potential for, this is something that people would more naturally think there is mental, from being displaced from a safe environment, assuming there was no abuse, more of the mental damage. But you're saying that they could even stem into physical repercussions, potentially speaking.
Yeah. And there's actually a book that I really like and I like to reference when it comes to thinking about trauma and how it manifests physically.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it's just such a great book, and it talks about all the ways that trauma can manifest. So like I said, chronic illness, issues with substance use, even higher rates of things like cancer, heart disease being at a greater risk for that as well. So the way that trauma affects our bodies and our minds, it's still being heavily researched, and we don't know everything and how it all affects people. But I think that book is a great place to start too. And I'm not trying to sell anything here or anything, but
no, resources are great. Yeah, we definitely want this to be a research-based adventure sort of that we're going on. Yeah. So could sudden displacement, you said, could cause trauma. What could this potentially, this trauma, my understanding, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm an educator. I've sought counseling on my own from a psychologist in the past. And some things that I heard in my understanding is that there are different types of traumas something can be an instantaneous trauma, like getting in a car crash, something that happens in that moment, or there could be trauma over a period of abuse or something over a period of time, like being in an abusive situation. But regardless of short or long, what are, just generally speaking from trauma, maybe concerning children, what are some long-term repercussions that trauma could cause?
Yeah, so I first want to start by saying too, you were mentioning how broad trauma can be and how, it could be instantaneous, it could be more long-term over time. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that what's traumatic for someone might not be traumatic for someone else.
Right.
And it's not necessarily what happens to you, it's how you handle it, the coping skills that you have, the support system around you, and the follow-up and maybe services that you get afterwards too. So I think that's important to mention with the discussion of trauma.
Yeah. Right. What are some potential long-term impacts could you see from trauma? So thinking of a scenario, or thinking of Clayton's scenario being displaced from his home at age 5, what could potentially be something you could see carried even into adulthood from this experience, whether it's noticeable by that person's perspective or not?
I think Clayton's situation specifically, and I want to be careful here because, of course, we want to hope the best for Clayton.
Mm-hmm.
And when he is reunified with his family, we want to hope that he is able to have outlets and learn coping skills to process everything that's happened.
Right.
With that being said, I think some things that we see, especially with children in the foster care system or that have interactions with DHS sometimes, could be potentially attachment issues. So developing an anxious or an avoidant attachment style could affect, potential relationships in the future with significant others, family members, friends. You could also see this manifest in a workplace setting as well. And some other things that you could see maybe substance use as a way to cope with unresolved trauma as well. And then again, the physical signs that we talked about, as well as, anxiety, depression, potentially PTSD, different mental health diagnoses as well.
And I imagine how they adapt and how people begin to react to their social environments. And we know, I think it makes sense that trauma, it does impact a person directly, but it, by extension, begins impacting a whole environment and it's a sort of a ripple effect, especially when you think of education and working in the classroom with other children. One child's behavior sets the tone, or could set the tone, or cause a chain reaction of behaviors in the classroom. So it's always interesting when you have such diversity in the classroom that we want to embrace diversity. But there is also sort of this negative side to it when it comes to trauma and it comes to experiences that will go from one child and somehow externally impact others around them. But sociology ties directly into it very clearly. So, but what do you feel would be the healthiest course of action in an ideal scenario? So let's say, for a child who's suddenly displaced from their home, and have to continue to struggle, what is the most ideal environment that would help that child begin to heal and adapt back to normality or normalcy?
Yeah. Are you talking about specifically if we're thinking about a case like Clayton?
So when Clayton comes home, what are some best practices that could be put in place for that child to help him adapt back to this would be, again, a new environment, his original environment, but in a way new? What type of practices do you think are best for a home and a family to put in place to help that child adapt back to this original environment once they were displaced?
When you ask that question, the first thing I think is, you mentioned how important it is for a person to be in an environment that's stable. And you talked about how, what happens to one person doesn't just happen to them, it happens to everyone around them as well. And you as a family have experienced significant trauma from all of this, the past years going through all this. So I feel like the first thing is for everyone to be able to seek the support and the services that they may need in going through this transition and this change when Clayton is reunited with the family. I think another thing too, and I see this in my work every day, is again how important it is for children to have structure and routines. So I feel maybe implementing routines for Clayton before and after school, and making sure that he has a structured environment, still obviously time for fun and for play and all that, but for that structure to help in him, learning that this is a stable environment, this is a safe environment. I was displaced and I shouldn't have been displaced, and I'm back now and I'm okay now. I think reassuring him too that where he's at now is a safe place, and his family is so happy to have him back.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And we see that similarity in education as well. The goal is always trying to clearly, obviously, make a safe environment, but sort of a sense of normalcy and a sense of purpose and reassuring purpose, then not that you're just constantly existing in these new environments and having to adaptation doesn't just happen instantly. So it's sort of like this transition that you have to work with, and we kind of see a similarity in the classroom, just because the fact is psychology and sociology follow us everywhere just because we're human. So we understand that we can't just abruptly do something that's even a good thing and expect the initial adaptation to just take place and sort of to latch on. I imagine, hypothetically speaking, that Clayton in some ways will be a different person when he comes back, and have picked up new habits and understandings or confusions coming in once again to a new environment, so to speak. So I like that you talked about having that sort of normalcy or normality as much as you can for a child. And that's something we obviously see all the time in the classroom too, that you want to just have a safe environment and sort of a normal environment and make things as natural as possible. What was the name of that book again?
Yeah, it's called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's by Bessel van der Kolk.
Okay. Yeah. We will definitely look into that. Kind of, if you have anything else that you think worth mentioning, something that pertains well to Clayton's situation or in general that would be good for people to be educated on, feel free to insert anything at this time. But those are kind of my questions that I have for you. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I'd like to say is how unfortunate this situation is, and the way that DHS in Oklahoma has handled this situation is not a representation of how they should be handling it. And I'm sure that's clear to everyone now that this isn't how things should be going. And we wish that this situation with Clayton was handled in an entirely different way, because this is not right, not ethical,
right,
illegal in some ways as well. So
yeah,
I for sure. And it just also goes to show that people in leadership positions or in larger agency positions, you can't always trust them. You can't.
Right.
And, for families and for vulnerable people who are going somewhere to get support and services and to be treated like this is just disgusting to me. And it makes my job as a social worker just so disheartening when I hear things like this, because it's something that I wish I could change. And,
right.
I'm sure we all wish we could change it, but, I just wanted to emphasize to you how disheartening it is.
Yeah, no, and we appreciate that. And really it boils down to so many different things, but we always want to make people understand that this is something that is in the hands of the people. The people that sort of cause this issue are elected officials on a local level. So pay attention, no matter where you are in the world or in the country, pay attention to your local elections. Your sheriff is elected and your sheriff appoints the investigator. The Wagoner County sheriff was elected and he appointed the investigator. The local level we forget about so much, and then sometimes someone just thrusts it into it like this. But our hope is for an awakening throughout the whole country for checks and balances and accountability. So Traci, the last thing is, if you'd like to, you just leave a message for Clayton himself, and whenever it's the appropriate age and time, we'd love for him to see everyone supporting him. So thank you, Traci Hicks, for coming on the Rescue Clayton podcast. And this is Traci Hicks' message for Clayton.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Gabe. Clayton, I can't even begin to imagine all that you have been going through the past years and all that your family has gone through. I know that you will be reunified with your family, and I know that they will never stop fighting for you. And I know that it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of a lot of intention to work through all of what's happened, but just know that you have such a huge support system around you, not only with your family, but with friends, everyone that's listening to this podcast, everyone that's watching the documentary, everyone that's supporting in any way they can through finances, through prayer, all of it. We're all here to support you, and you are not alone.
Thank you. And for anyone listening you can go to rescueclayton.com and help support this podcast. We want this to be a research-based effort, so your money goes towards that. And also, if you want to watch the Saving Clayton documentary, you go to savingclayton.com, and you can pay-per-view the documentary. Rescueclayton.com will loop you to the documentary, to the podcast, to everything. So a good place to keep in mind, because there's so many different websites at this point, is rescueclayton.com. Thank you, Traci, for all your comments and your information and expertise on this, and for being here on the Rescue Clayton podcast.
Thank you, Gabe. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to draw?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go. What are you doing? Baby. What are you doing? Are you cheesing?
For this next part of the podcast, we gathered footage from Red River TV and Project 46, the film companies out of Oklahoma City that made the Saving Clayton documentary. Kevin Batts of Red River TV sat down with Kay Saunders, who worked for Oklahoma DHS and Texas DHS for a good number of years.
Had a career in social work. I worked for the Department of Human Services in the Child Welfare Division for 35 years in all. I worked 11 years in Texas, 24 years in Oklahoma. During that time, I probably spent about 8 years doing child welfare or child abuse and neglect investigations. I worked also developing foster homes and worked with foster parents and foster children. I supervised workers who investigated different child welfare referrals for about 4 years. And then my last 18 years was spent in the administration at the Laura Dester Children's Center, which was an emergency shelter for children who were immediately removed from their homes due to abuse or neglect allegations. And then it was also a place where children could come back if there was a disruption in a placement.
Kay goes on to describe her experience with DHS and the expectations that were set when it comes to recognizing child abuse. It's important to note that Kay Saunders is also a close friend of the Woolley family and has known the Woolley family as she has attended the same church. She's also made contact and had plenty of interactions with Clayton himself.
When I first met Clayton, he was about 4 months old, and the Woolleys had just gotten guardianship of him.
What's important to note here with Kay Saunders' observation of Clayton is that Clayton was born to a drug abusive mother at the time. Kay goes on to describe how Clayton lacks to make eye contact and seems some bit anxious in his early years, but the fact that the Woolleys took great care of him showed that he grew out of those habits and became a much more social and aware child as care with Bill and Lisa Woolley went on.
And what I observed was that his eye contact was delayed, had some startle issues, and that he was extremely small. As he grew, I'd say probably from like 1 to 3, it was noticeable that he had speech delay.
What's interesting to note is that in one of the reports from the prosecution, they don't mention anything about Clayton's speech impediment or delay. However, his family does mention this, and Kay Saunders, in her observation of Clayton Woolley, also mentions that he had a speech impediment and delays. This information went on totally disregarded by the Oklahoma prosecution, by DHS, by Wagoner County.
However, as I watched him grow, he really started being able to control his behavior. He calmed down. He was self-assured and confident. And always, Clayton was a happy child. He was friendly and happy, although he did have those delays initially. And he still had a speech delay at the time that he was removed.
Kay Saunders describes what you want to look for when you are observing abuse of a child or potential abuses. She mentions the fact that if you are a child coming from an abusive home, a common practice is that the family will want to keep you separate from other people in order to avoid being caught for any type of abuse.
In sexual abuse cases, those were the cases that were, you would look for isolated families. Oftentimes, they would not allow their child to have contact with other children, other people. You might see fear or, a child not be able to answer a question without looking and getting permission from the parent. What I saw with the Woolley family was that they encouraged activities with their older children, that they engaged them in many things. With the grandchildren, they were very open. People could hold them. They went to nursery. They went to daycare at times. There was never any, I never observed any hesitation or any secrecy on their part. Instead, they were quite open with issues that they were dealing with as a family, and they were, open to advice. They sought advice, and so this was not a typical thing that you would see in a family that's guilty of sexual abuse.
Counter to that idea, Clayton was in fact very social. He was in t-ball, in sports, very active in the church, and Bill and Lisa Woolley, his caretakers, always kept him around other people. Kay Saunders states in her observation of Clayton that she did not see any of these signs that she's trained to look for. In fact, she saw quite the opposite. Clayton actually progressed in his mental, spiritual, and physical health as he was cared for by Bill and Lisa Woolley.
What I observed with Clayton and his grandparents, really from tiny on, was that he was strongly attached to them. I never observed any fear. Even when he acted out, the Woolleys would respond to him in a loving fashion. He didn't seem fearful when knew he was in trouble. They just appeared to have a very healthy, loving relationship.
Kay Saunders goes on to explain why she decided to get involved in this specific case despite her retirement from Oklahoma DHS. It's very evident that she has trust in the Woolley family, and she seems disheartened from the work that was done by Oklahoma DHS. Many people have become aware that this has been careless work by Wagoner County. Kay Saunders took her time to be careful with her thoughts, to articulate herself well from her experience, and we appreciate her time with Project 46, Red River TV, and the Rescue Clayton Podcast.
In all my years as a social worker, I have never allowed myself to get involved in any type of physical, sexual, any type of abuse or neglect situations, because as a worker, I know that oftentimes you don't have the whole picture. You don't know all the allegations. and there are many factors. But in this situation, I had spent about 5 hours a week for 5 years with this family. I never saw any dynamic of child abuse or neglect. I never saw anything inappropriate with the Woolleys and how they responded to their own children as well as their own grandchildren. They were loving and kind and truly were an exemplary family. And so this is why I decided to get involved with this situation.
Unfortunately, this is not the first time we've seen professionals ignored by the prosecution or people trying to speak against the Woolleys' testimony and story.
When I did talk to the person doing the initial investigation, and I was saying to him I had never seen anything. I mean, nothing had alerted me, or never did I question anything about what was going on in their home. The investigator said to me, I didn't really either. And that was very concerning to me.
Since this has began, the Woolley family has quickly discovered that this is not an isolated event. There have been many other families that have experienced similar or the same injustice from the same county, from the same city, and from the same state of Oklahoma, even the same sheriff in Wagoner County and investigators out of Wagoner County. We want this to be a research-based podcast and information that shows how this applies to every Oklahoma citizen, every American citizen, and everyone who votes for people who sit inside these entities, like the position of sheriff and the appointed positions that are within DHS and investigators in your county and the state of Oklahoma. There's a huge lack of discipline and professionalism that was coming from the Wagoner County officials. There are plenty of people out there with plenty of experience that handle things in a professional way and handle things in accordance to innocent until proven guilty. That is in fact not what we have seen from Wagoner County. So it's really important that we show and highlight how things should have been done here, and we back that up with research. It's important to note that these people have taken time out of their day because they believe in the Woolley story, because they believe in Bill and Lisa's innocence, and because they believe that Clayton needs to be coming home to the Woolley family. This should not be going on ignored by anybody, as it pertains to all Americans and all Oklahomans. I'm a teacher. I work with children. I have a family. I think it's important for everyone to realize that their vote counts, and that the elected officials that have caused issues with the Woolley family and with Clayton here are in fact just that. They are elected officials that you, as a citizen of Oklahoma and citizens of the United States of America, have the opportunity to re-elect or to not re-elect. It's important to know that citizens have a voice here, and it's not just the Woolley family. This is Oklahoma DHS. This is a whole Wagoner County. This is the whole state of Oklahoma. And it goes beyond that. We're talking to professionals here even beyond the state of Oklahoma. Traci Hicks is based out of Michigan. We have people that we've talked to out of Florida. We've had people that I've talked to out of Arizona. This is a issue that goes to every corner of the United States of America that all Americans need to be aware of. It is supposed to be the investigators come in when 911 is called, and they are supposed to let the evidence present itself, and the evidence is supposed to speak towards what happened. That is not what happened here in Wagoner County. Wagoner County officials decided what they wanted the narrative to be based off of their prior biases. It's documented, it's discussed, it's been talked about in court, and it goes on ignored. In this case, Oklahoma DHS has lacked in their accountability, lacked in their transparency, lacked in their professionalism when it comes to the story of the Woolley family in Clayton. This is a case of guilty until proven innocent. That is anti-American. That is anti-law. The law is there to hold citizens accountable. That is their job. However, as we live in a constitutional republic and we have voting, It is the citizens' job to hold the law accountable. We cannot forget that entities like DHS, the education system, and all entities throughout the nation and Oklahoma are systems made up of human beings that are capable of bias, wrongdoing, or making mistakes. It is the people's job, we the people, to hold citizens, each other accountable, but also to be holding these entities that are made up of human beings accountable. The law holds us accountable, but who holds the law accountable? If you want to know more about this story, about this podcast, and how you can help donate to support the Rescue Clayton Podcast and make sure that it's continuously a research-based pursuit, you can go to rescueclayton.com and find the Give, Send, Go link there. We are very grateful to Kevin, Janelle, and Miles with Project 46 and Red River TV for letting us use this footage. They've done very diligent work with the Saving Clayton documentary. If you go to rescueclayton.com, you can find information about the Saving Clayton documentary, as well as how to donate to help support this podcast. Again, that is rescueclayton.com. I want to give a special thank you to Josh Morton with Morton Media for his diligence with this production, for his pursuit of truth and ethical media. That's another thing we often see lacking throughout our whole nation is ethical media, and we wanted to make sure we touched on that in the Rescue Clayton podcast because it pertains directly to this story and it pertains directly to every American. At the end of the day, we need to remember that we are not a democracy in America. We are a constitutional republic. We have citizen elected officials in positions. We hold elections and we have a right to vote. We can't forget that elected officials, when they're put in these positions by citizens, are responsible to answer to citizens. Elected officials work for us, we the people. These people who are in elected positions, like the Wagoner County Sheriff, they work for the citizens of Wagoner County, the citizens of Oklahoma. There needs to be checks and balances for these people in elected positions so that these individuals, these people, cannot trample on the rights of other citizens.
Uncle Gabe, you be staying at the house and eat pancakes with us in the daytime, and I love you.